This is a story about Sherman Sizemore, a former coal miner and Baptist minister who, by anybody's account, was a loving husband and family man who loved his grandchildren. Suddenly, he became paranoid. He didn't want to be left alone. He had bouts of being unable to breathe. He was convinced that people were trying to bury him alive. He refused to be around the grandchildren he absolutely adored. And on the rare occasion when he could fall asleep, he had nightmares. One night,
Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home alone on the couch when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him. And his scream startled Ruby so that she started screaming. And so she looks at her husband and he's still just looking straight out ahead. He's terrified of something in front of him. And so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. After he stopped screaming, he just continued to look straight out as if whatever had terrified him had him in this trance where he couldn't look away. And so his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face is going white, he's starting to sweat, and Ruby's starting to panic. She has no idea what's happening with him. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance. And he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." Ruby has never seen behavior like this in her husband ever. This is a completely different person she's interacting with. All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming about something that Ruby couldn't see. And so Ruby called the rest of the family and had them come over to figure out what they were going to do. But when Sherman found out his family was coming to his house, he told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. The only person he could be around was Ruby, and his whole family had no idea what to do.
what could have gone wrong here? Well, the only thing that he was having a challenge with was a pain in his side. And the doctor said he wanted to do some exploratory surgery, even though he was pretty sure that the issue had to do with the gallbladder. After some discussion with the family, Sherman decided that he was going to go forth with the operation. So on January 19th, 2006, he underwent this surgery. And it went pretty normal. As they do, you go in, you get into your gown, and you get rolled in. He was rolled into the operating room. And they went through the routine mask over your face and count to 10, which he did. And they moved on with the surgery. Well, the challenge was that he was awake for 16 minutes of that surgery. Now, apparently it's a 2-part cocktail that the anesthesiologist will give you. So I guess the first one kind of shuts your body down, puts you in a state of paralysis. And then the second part puts you unconscious during the process. Well, they cut into him and he felt every bit of that operation. And it was horrifying because he couldn't move to let them know. They had tape over his eyes, and so he couldn't make eye contact. Definitely couldn't speak because his vocal cords were shut down as well. And for 16 minutes, he endured every cut, every pain, every clamp. He heard everything that was going on until after 16 minutes, a nurse recognized that he was still awake and they put him under. If you're enjoying the story, please take time to subscribe to the channel. It's free, and like and share the video. Now back to the story. Now they knew, everything I'm telling you came down the line in a lawsuit. So it wasn't like his family knew this up front. They gave him a drug to make him forget that 16 minutes of the operation. And so they figured that there would probably be no trauma for him at all if he could not remember this. Well, that kind of didn't work very well, because during his time in the hospital, he kept trying to tell them that he was feeling some kind of way. I don't know if it's that he was having flashbacks or what, but they just poo-pooed him and said, no, that can't be. That's just your imagination. But when he got home, his mind remembered what he did not. So it was a subconscious thing that had him hollering and screaming and paranoid. And he thought he was crazy because the nightmares were so vivid. Unfortunately, the terror was too much and he unalived himself. Now, this was a terrible waste and a horrible story. The family did sue and they settled it. Of course, we'll never know what they settled it for. The reason I'm bringing you this story is because it struck me as to what we go through when we're experiencing anxiety attacks, what we go through when the stress from a traumatic event that we may or may not remember causes us physical anguish. If this man did not remember consciously ever going through 16 minutes of agony, but that trauma remained in his physical body and in his subconscious, how much more does trauma affect people who are going through anxiety attacks? They don't know what the problem is. They don't understand why. There's no evident threat there. It's really serious because this shows how trauma affects us physiologically, regardless of whether or not that trauma was physical. It could be mental, emotional abuse. Anything will reside in our body. And I looked up some studies on DNA because I had heard that they determined that trauma could change the DNA. And I couldn't understand that. So I did some digging and I determined that there was a study done on mice that determined that there were some changes in the DNA, which wasn't good enough for me because my thing is that's a mouse. What are you going to do about checking this out in human beings? And as the studies progressed and as I look further, it's not that it changed the basis of your DNA. Your DNA is your DNA. It's not going to change. But how that's methylated changes. Now, here's the definition of methylation. Methylation is a chemical reaction in the body in which a small molecule called a methyl group gets added to DNA, proteins, or other molecules. The addition of methyl groups can affect how some molecules act in the body. So it's not that our actual DNA itself changes, but that methylation, how it's expressing itself, changes. And there were even studies that showed that if a woman was pregnant and experienced trauma, that it did affect the fetus on some level, DNA-wise. They determined trauma does affect you and that this can be passed on to your children, but they're trying to determine how much of that passing on has to do with environmental things or how you are expressing your trauma stress in the parenting relationship. It's enough to know that this mess will reside in your body. I've only had one major panic attack in my life, and I went out of a federal building in Chicago in an ambulance because I thought I was having a heart attack. So I know how real that is in your body. I just thought maybe this story would be helpful to somebody because we tend to want to kind of look down on ourselves and feel like something's wrong with me. It's not your fault that somebody did things to you like that, okay? And one of our greatest struggles is understanding that it's not our fault. And that's just the beginning of stopping taking false responsibility within ourselves for some event over which we had absolutely no control. So don't feel bad about yourself. Just accept that the reason you're going through this physiological manifestation is because of trauma that you may or may not have remembered. And remember that trauma and our dealing with a traumatic past has two components. It's physical and it's emotional. So we have to deal with it on those two levels, two separate levels. And you may be further along in learning how to cope with it emotionally than you are with getting over these anxiety attacks. But trust me, over time, you may conquer both of them. So don't blame yourself for what happened to you. Always remember Mr. Sizemore. They gave him an amnesiac drug to make him forget it. And in his waking hours, his body just wouldn't let it go. So while he wasn't remembering it in his mind, those nightmares were tearing him up. And he became completely paranoid and he could not sleep and he didn't want to be around the family that he loved so dearly. And he wound up taking himself out because of that trauma. That's a sad situation, but I had to bring you that story if you hadn't heard it because it does apply to us in our trauma. Well, I hope that was helpful. Just a quick story to bring home the fact that this is a challenge and a progressive journey in our healing. It'll have ups and downs and spin arounds. Look, if you want to know more about the dynamics of that up and down healing journey from the mouth of an individual who has been there and done that, be sure to watch this video right here. And always remember, your greatest power is realizing the truth of who you are. Know that truth.